And here we are, back again at it. MotoZone TV, production of Zone Television and Zone Television Media. I'm here with HTV Blue, my guest. We're here on the ongoing and continuing discussion of the Triumph Daytona 675, the future of the super middleweights, in particular the triple cylinder bikes. And we've discussed in the last we talked a little bit about where could Triumph possibly go, and what is left for the people that are huge fans of the triple cylinder bikes in terms of what the options are. We've sort of gone over at some length of detail as to trying to make some kind of comparison contrast between the Daytona 675 and the F3 675. There are some modest similarities, but I would say they probably really stop and end at aesthetics. Beneath the skin, there's a lot more going on underneath there. Now, HTV Blue, you have had an opportunity to actually look at an F3 up close and personal. So do you want to share with the rest of us a little bit about what your findings are? And
yeah, sure. Yeah, I was in a very lucky position yesterday to be able to go down to an MV dealer, and we were looking at some of their bikes, and managed to pull apart an F3 pretty much to its component parts. Why, I hear you ask? That very good question. But it was good to see exactly what the kind of make and quality of the parts within the bike are. MV used to have a very, very good reputation for being sterling quality. The individual parts that have made up the bikes were sterling quality, and it largely explained why the company didn't make any money on any of the bikes that it was selling. I have to say, on the new MV, the parts certainly look a good deal cheaper. The engine is certainly where the majority of the investment has gone into this motorcycle, and I don't think that's a bad thing at all myself. They clearly know how to make the trellis frame together with the aluminium backplate, which holds the engine, the rear of the engine, and the swing arm. So they know how to make those. They invested a good amount of money into the quality of the engine. However, the remainder of the parts are a little bit less than ideal. I know that we're having a look at an original equipment exhaust, and the welds were some of the worst I have seen on a machine, presuming that it is a machine that welds them. Some of the worst I've ever seen. The quality of the metal was very, very poor as well. Again, this isn't this may sound like I'm being critical, and I don't really mean it as a criticism, merely as a comment.
But nonetheless, it does come down to a criticism of the quality control with respect to the product. But it sounds to me a bit like what you're saying, and some of what we concluded in our discussions is that the emphasis of the expenditures that went into the F3 675 were primarily focused around the R&D of the engine and the chassis, and that's kind of where the buck sort of stopped there, and then the other the componentry on the bike was sort of just inconsequential, I guess.
I think that's exactly true. I mean, Italian motorcycle companies have a good head start because some of the parts, such as the forged wheels or Brembo as a brake manufacturer. They make these parts and are happy to give them to Italian companies, probably at better prices than perhaps you would get them if you are not an Italian company. Incidentally, that's only my opinion. I have no idea if that's true. That's just a guess. But the chassis is very similar to the one they had on the old F4. Essentially, it's exactly the same idea. The front part of the headstock starts as a steel trellis. It wraps round the side of the engines, and then right at the rear there is a cast aluminium piece for either side that it connects to.
Mm-hmm.
That is nothing new for MV. They know how to make those. They probably will not have cost anything in R&D, essentially. The parts that they add to them are the same parts that they've added to other bikes, with the Marzocchi forks at the front and the Sachs shock at the back. While we're talking about low quality items, the Sachs shock is a shock that I have forgotten the name of exactly now, but it's one that's well known. It's been on lots of new bikes, and it's a very poor quality shock, in fairness. Very small amount of adjustment available within it, and really from maximum to minimum, the difference is negligible. So they've certainly saved some money on the components there. The engine, as I say, I think is a very high-tech piece of work. I know you've got some figures, I think, for us about bore stroke and compression ratios.
Yes. First, we're going to go to the this would be the Daytona 675 from years 2006 to, I'm sorry, this is the 2014 MV-F3, my bad. That was not the one I wanted to bring up. But that's neither here nor there. Let me just see if I can correct that. Okay. Let me go back to a screen share here. And so let's see what we have.
Just while you're looking for that, just to fill in the space, obviously the Triumph has changed. It was initially released in 2006, and in 2012, I think it was, they updated the engine, making it slightly more over square.
Mm-hmm.
The most obvious visual change is moving the exhaust from under the seat to a right-hand side exhaust. I just thought I'd tell people that didn't know that interesting fact.
Yes, well, certainly that's worth mentioning. Now, if you're looking at your screen, I have the specs in terms of bore stroke, compression, and horsepower for the 2006 to 2011 Daytona 675. We have a bore of 74 millimeters, a stroke of 52 millimeters, and a compression ratio of 12.65 to 1, and a rear wheel horsepower number. This is an approximation of about 100 rear wheel horsepower. I think it's probably worth mentioning at this point. The reason why we're introducing compression ratios into the mix here, the higher compression ratio, well, naturally aspirated high horsepower engines tend to have high compression ratio numbers, which is why you're told that it's best to use the high octane fuel in your bikes. The higher the compression, it's certainly more pertinent that you use high octane fuel. Compression ratio has to do with, I guess you could think of it as in terms of explosion. The higher the compression ratio, the greater the explosion, the more efficient or the more fuel is actually being expelled or burned off in a higher compression engine, which means that it's more efficient and will produce a higher horsepower number. So I thought that anecdote might be worth mentioning, since we're discussing the merits of engine design and what's going
So
on.
what you're essentially saying is you get a bigger explosion from a higher compression ratio.
Correct. Yes. For the lay, that's for the lay person. A higher compression number means a bigger explosion in the motor. To grossly oversimplify the point. Okay.
Nothing wrong with grossly oversimplifying.
I didn't think so. So here we have bore, and when we're talking about bore, we're talking about the cylinder, the diameter, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong. The diameter of the cylinder wall, which is the circular, the amount.
In millimeters.
Yes, in millimeters. When we're talking about stroke, we're talking about the amount of distance. It has to do with a connecting rod, or the amount, the distance the piston will travel up and down inside of the cylinder, up and down inside the cylinder, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So when you have a higher stroke number, that means the stroke is longer. When you have a lower stroke number, you have a shorter stroke.
And again, to extend that theory, again in a simpler way, essentially a longer stroke and a smaller bore will give you more torque or more mid-range, whereas a smaller bore, or sorry, a larger bore and a shorter stroke will give you better high-end power.
Right, and so when we're talking about sports bikes, the tendency in design has been towards the latter, which is the higher top end, or producing the power in the higher RPM rev range of the motorcycle.
Indeed.
So these are the numbers here for the 2006 to 2011 Daytona 675 Triple. And so those are the numbers relative or respectively. Now, if we move on to the next bike, which would be, let's see here.
The updated Daytona, I guess.
Yeah, I'm just going to do a desktop screen share to make it easier on myself. Here we have, we're going to be looking at the numbers on a 2014 Daytona 675. Now we have a bore of 76 millimeters and a stroke of 49.58 and a higher compression ratio of 13:1:1, and we have an approximately 103.6 rear wheel horsepower. So you can see in the newer, well, I guess in the 2013 and forward Daytonas, they increased the bore, they shortened the stroke, and they bumped the compression ratio up. By shortening the stroke, the newer Daytonas have a higher median red line, which means that the engine will rev higher. There will be a higher rev count on the motor with a shorter stroke, if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's essentially there is a limit to how fast a piston can move in any engine. This is true for a MotoGP bike as it is for a 50cc moped. There is a maximum speed at which a piston can move up and down. So there's a maximum stroke that it can move over its stroke. There's a maximum speed that it can hit. I think, if I remember correctly, it's something along the lines of 27 meters a second. Anyway, the point of this is that if you increase the bore, you really... No, I'm going to overly complicate things if I go down that route.
Okay.
But I think where I've mentioned it is probably the best bet. There is a maximum speed that you want the piston to go and keep some measure of reliability.
Right.
Essentially, if you go beyond that point, you're heading yourself into trouble.
Right. Okay, so now we're going to go from the current Daytona 675 and move on to the MV MVAGusta F3 675. And here, if I'm up on the screen, just
You
let
are,
me know.
yeah.
Okay, we have the F3 675, and we have a bore of 79. So we've actually gone an additional 3 millimeters above the Daytona 675, and we actually have a stroke of an even shorter stroke in the F3, and we have a higher even higher compression ratio in the F3. Now this is what gives the F3 the ability to rev count out to approximately 15,000 RPM, which is which is spot on with pretty much all of the inline four bikes in its class respectively.
Which
And
originally, I think people suggested that a three-cylinder wouldn't be able to rev high enough to be competitive with an inline four.
exactly right, which kind of allows us to segue into the results of this year's World Supersport in WSBK in the WSS standings. Now, it kind of pains me to have to admit that yes, Honda did win the WSS, the World Supersport, with I think it was Vandermark, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah.
on the CBR 600. Now,
Well, I
interestingly,
would like to say actually before you go on to and analyse the bikes in this, is that I personally believe that Michael Vandermark is the class of that field. So I think whatever bike he had been competing on would probably have won.
mhm.
I think that's worth bearing in mind. Jules Cluzel, who was riding for MVAGusta, I don't think is quite in the same league, although he's come from the GP paddock, the MotoGP paddock. I think Michael Vandermark is on his way up in the world, and Jules Cluzel is in the latter part of his career. Although he's not an old guy by any means, but I think he's probably reached as high as he's likely to get. Whereas Vandermark, next year, for instance, you'll see him riding Jonathan Ray's old Fireblade in the World Superbike.
Well, this is the thing that astonishes me. You have, I guess, what you're calling, for lack of a better term, a subpar rider on the MVF3 and a superior rider on a CBR 600 bike, and yet Jules Cluzel was able to clinch second place on the MVF3, which was, to my mind, completely astonishing and caught everybody in the field off guard.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can say without fear of criticism that nobody really expected MVAGusta to be fighting for first in the championship. Arguably, they're a little way behind Honda. But if you look at the various size or the comparative size between Honda and MVAGusta, you know, you're worlds apart in terms of R&D. And for MVAGusta to be even mentioned in the same breath, really, as Honda Racing Corporation, it shows the size of their ability to compete. I mean, a fantastic result, really.
Well, the other thing, again, coming back to what you were saying about Vandermark being essentially the Mark Marquez in his class,
Yeah.
to use a crude analogy, and to have, I guess, this gentleman, Jules Cluzel, on the F3 to clinch second place in points and score as high as they did and win as many races as they did in World Superbike.
And he fell off a fair bit as well.
Yeah, I just think, I mean, this speaks to the bike on which he's riding, which sort of begs another question, and that's a whole other topic of discussion, which is more important, the rider of the bike. And of course, there was this all this to do about, you know, Honda making the claim, or somebody making the claim, that with respect to the Honda motorcycles, that it was 90% bike and 10% rider and that whole thing. But I don't want to get into all that right now. But I mean, it does speak to the point of the engineering that's gone into this bike, and which kind of makes me want to segue into another aspect of the F3 675 over the F4. Now, certainly, we had a discussion about MVAGusta sort of rising from the ashes and sort of continuing the legacy of being owned by a royal family, and I believe that the company originally had started off being, was its genesis or its inception was created by a royal family, and sort
Count
of
Augusta, in fact, his name was.
yeah, and then you have the Castiglione family taking over. And then I kind of want to get into a little bit of the incestuous relationship that went on between Ducati and MVAGusta, because I don't think a lot of, some of the viewers may not be aware that there is actually, their paths had crossed, albeit briefly, over the last 15 to 20 years. And so if we could go into a little bit about that, and then which would allow us to talk a little bit about the M4, but then also tracing the F3's roots back to their original championship winning three-cylinder bike, the 350 and the 500, under Giacomo Agostini. And it's probably worth mentioning at this point also that Honda has not yet been able to match the amount of world well, there's a sort of kind of what is it, factory wins or something like that, I think, versus
manufacturer wins.
Manufacturer wins versus overall wins. So I guess that would be like splitting hairs. But apparently, it's my understanding that MV's record has not yet been broken. So.
Absolutely right. They're still the most successful company in Grand Prix racing, which is quite astonishing to say they haven't been in it for 30, 40 years. I think that's really quite impressive. Going on to the relationship between Ducati and MVAGusta, with the inception of the World Superbike Series in 1988, the idea of this was being brought up in conjunction. Prior to that, most manufacturers were involved only in Grand Prix racing. The idea of this was that the factory would create the best motorcycle they can within a set of rules, and they would compete against the other manufacturers. Fairly straightforward, quite obvious. Then was a move with the 80s where road racing replicas became very popular. To race these bikes on track, to race the replicas of the race machines on track. And so this was set up in 1988, and I believe Bimota won the very first race, but it was Honda that won the first two championships with their iconic RC30 racing motorcycle. Mm-hmm. However, the most successful firm throughout the 28 years, or exactly where we are, I can't remember, but years of competing, is Ducati. And over 25 years, though obviously we've gone on a bit from there, but when there was 25 years of it, Ducati famously had won 18 of the 25 championships, which for a small company based in the north of Italy is quite astonishing against the might of the Japanese. And at the time, the reason why this is relevant to what we're discussing is at the time Ducati was owned by the Castiglione family. They had a very famous designer called Massimo Tamburini designed the Ducati 916, and they employed an English chap called Carl Fogarty to race their bike. He had actually raced the year before for them on their 888 superbike, and had done okay. But then he introduced this 916, and although it took a couple of races for the bike to really get sorted, once it had, he became almost unstoppable. Mm-hmm. Ducati then went on to dominate really the 1990s, with the exception of Honda in 1997 with their RC45, which took the entire financial might of Honda Racing Corporation to replace one of the most iconic bikes, the RC30, with the RC45, and they won just one championship. And that was a brief moment where Carl Fogarty didn't win the World Superbike Championship. As I say, the reason why this relates to what we're talking about today is that the Castiglione family at that time owned Ducati, and they were a very small firm involved in superbike racing.
Not dissimilar to the way MVAGusta is today.
Exactly. Indeed, there came a point where they were looking at designing a replacement for the 916 and 996 and 998 as it later became, but for that model of motorcycle. And what was originally penned essentially is the bike that later became the MVAGusta F3, because in the intervening time Ducati had been sold off and the Castigliones bought MVAGusta, which brings us nicely and rather long-windedly round in a full circle to MVAGusta now owned by the Castigliones and having their new bike, the F3, that was released in 1998, designed by Massimo Tamburini, the chap that had done the Ducati 916.
So this really is an interesting turn of events, because then the F3 was originally intended to be a Ducati. So could one sort of theorize that perhaps the F3 was really the fresh start that the Castigliones were looking for to really put MV back on the map? Because I understand that the F4's performance was very much lackluster and had, well, I guess continues to be somewhat lackluster even through to today. But I guess my point in all that was, I just find it interesting that they chose to resurrect the inline three-cylinder bike. And I don't know what the consideration was, but I understand that 4 years of research and development went into the F3, that the F3 was actually the last bike that the patriarch Castiglione laid eyes on, as well as Tamburini, before either of them passed away. Even though the F3 was penned by Adrian Morton, the British graphic designer, and I find there's a strange irony in all this, because to me the F3 sort of embodies the essence of MVAGusta, going back to the days of Giacomo Agostini and the 350 and the 500, which he won there just nothing could touch this bike. And I think, or it seems to me, that they were really trying to embody that, which kind of puts us to the numbers, comparing the numbers or juxtaposing the horsepower and the technical specifications of the Triumph motor against the F3 motor. You can see that MV had really wanted this motor to shine, and it certainly does. I mean, I understand that. I guess all of the reviewers have more or less said the same thing. They feel that the F3 has so much potential that it's not really reached its full potential, because there's been some, to do with the electronics and so forth. And it's my understanding that now that Mercedes has come aboard, they're really making a concerted effort to resolve all of those impending things with the F3. And the other thing that's exciting about this discussion is the F3, 675, and 800 have actually given the sport bike enthusiasts who love three-cylinder motorcycles somewhere else to go.
And I think that's a really key point. I mean, we've said in previous discussions that I think Triumph, who are probably the most notable three-cylinder producers, with their 675 managed to turn a whole bunch of people onto the idea of a three-cylinder sports bike, which initially I think the press were a bit skeptical about, thinking that it would be underpowered in comparison to an inline four, which had been the norm for that class. And so they managed to convince people that it was a great bike, and then they just haven't gone any further with it, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I don't want to count the goose out before the box has gone into the hole, to use a canned movie term from Mad Max. And incidentally, for all of you Aussies that are listening, it was because of that movie that got me into motorcycling. And it was actually, I think it was the Road Warrior initially. That got me into it, but I went back and saw the first installation of the series, which was Mad Max, and I was, hooked at that point, and so it was no wonder my first bike ended up being a Kawasaki GPZ 550. But anyway, that's a digression from the whole point. But my point is that I just think that it's just been really exciting to see. The development that's gone into the three-cylinder, and the three-cylinder becoming relevant, almost to the point of, there's so much. It seems like that there's so much more that they can do with it that's not being done. I know that Triumph has gone off onto the adventure bike market, and they
seem to have just sort of given up a little bit on the
I hate to say it. I really feel like they. I mean, how old is the Speed Triple, for freak's sake? It's a great bike. Don't get me wrong. I love the Speed Triple, and of course again, not to beat a dead horse, but I own the Street Triple 675. I mean, I own that bike. I love that bike. It's a great bike. It just pains me. It's been exacerbating. Like, what are you guys doing? Throwing new paint on the bike, and just it's just terminally frustrating, really.
I mean, I know the bike, the 67, the Daytona was updated a couple of years ago, but it wasn't a huge update, really. It was more a manufacturing details update, in as much as it was Triumph working out how to make the same motorcycle cheaper, more than it was about providing something new and exciting for the consumers.
Right. Which kind of brings us on to another point. We had been talking about high-spec, low-horsepowered bikes. Okay. High-spec, low... Oh, we have somebody who's commenting in the thread here, a Slippery Mongoose. I believe he's from Australia. Let me just read off what he's been saying in the thread. He says, most Italian motor companies have crossed paths through the years, merged, exception, Italian, forgiveness. I agree that the going back to the roots of MV and the F3, he says, interesting, mentioned Mercedes. When Nat Geo did the Mega Factories documentary, Sun was coming to work at the brand, the new AMG E-Class. He says that Triumph are wanting the cult status of the GS. I'm not sure I understand what the... okay.
I assume with the adventure bike, he
okay,
means, I guess.
right, yeah, the BMW, the GS. So here's the problem. I mean, you can't scatter your fire and at the same time expect to hit the mark. Obviously, if you're putting R&D development into into one area of the company, it seems to me you're pulling people away from other areas of the company that probably would do as well or whatever. But we had also talked about the sport bike. I guess the baby boomers and the Gen Xers and that sort of thing are maybe outgrowing the whole sport bike thing. I don't know if that's the contention, but I guess they generally go put the R&D and the marketing into where the money seems to be. But we had talked about high-spec, low-horsepowered sport bikes and the offerings. There seems to be a niche market for such bikes. And we had mentioned, just to sort of recapitulate on the older triples. Recently, as you know, I've created a not many any of the viewers or listeners are interested. I have a community. It's called 3 THREE on Google Plus, and it's basically an homage to three-cylinder motorcycles. And it sort of rekindled my interest with going back to a lot of these bikes that have been instrumental in influencing a lot of riders, and in particular the old H1, the S1 Kawasaki air-cooled two-stroke inline threes, and they even had 250cc inline threes. I remember somebody had mentioned, there was talk about, wouldn't it be cool if Triumph, made a small displacement inline three? Well, that's already been done, and Kawasaki was one of the first. Suzuki, I believe, also had small displacement three cylinders. I think it was the GT 350 or something to that effect. But Kawasaki, they had a 250, they had a 350, they had a 400, they had a 500, and they had a 750. So they ran the gamut with that. But to me, right now, if you had a high spec, small displacement,
multi-cylinder, that's the extra bit.
Yes, multi-cylinder sports bike, I would gladly, and I think there are a lot of guys that would gladly fork over $7,000, $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 for such a bike in lieu of having a bike that it just, these leader bikes, they're great, they're a lot of fun and that sort of thing, but they're really too much bike, they're really more bike than anyone needs for the road, with the exception of living out, being a flatlander or living out in some of these vast areas where you can really, whack the throttle open and go. But I just think that I'm of the opinion that there is a huge market for the bikes that we've been talking about. I mean, it just seems like they're not,
I think manufacturers are scared that, although many of us say that we want a low capacity, high spec bike, if they produced one, people would say, but it's got such a small capacity, it should be cheaper than a high capacity bike. Mm-hmm. And I have to say, I have fallen into that sort of sense as well. With KTM have their new RC390, and in England it's going to cost £5,000. And when I first heard that, I thought that is too expensive, considering what you can get. I mean, that's £500 more than Suzuki's V-twin SV650. Which is, more than 200 cc's bigger, is a V-twin as opposed to a single cylinder, so arguably will be a nicer engine to ride, certainly over any kind of distance. And so there is still sort of this element of the fear that a cheaper or that a low capacity bike is expected to be cheaper. But I think a lot of that is due to what the manufacturers have done in the past. Mm-hmm. It has become absolutely synonymous now small capacity bikes has come absolutely synonymous with budget.
Well, do you know something?
They can't help themselves.
This is the interesting commentary. I was at Cycle Gear earlier today, and I had a discussion with the store manager, and he was like a Yamaha R6 type of guy. He was just hardcore sport bike, and he went and he got rid of that bike, and he went and he got himself a DRZ 400 Supermoto, and he says he has way much more fun on that bike. The reason why is because, and I think a lot of guys, you're seeing a huge Supermoto sort of, what's the term I'm looking for? The Supermoto cults are springing up all over the place.
Right, yeah, it's sort of a new movement.
Well, yeah, the reason, I'm of the opinion the reason for that is because Supermotors are based on dual sport or enduro bikes. Those bikes tend to be extremely light.
Yeah.
And they have these, really relatively high horsepower, but mostly high torquey, very torquey
Yeah.
motors, and they can shred through turns every bit as with a competent rider, almost
Mm.
every bit as good as these super sport bikes can. So which begs the question: why does somebody want a 450 freaking pound
Yeah.
dumbbell that they got to flog around the thing when they can have something with like 1/3 less the weight, like around 200 pounds and change, or relatively maybe around the 300 poundish thing, like a
Yeah.
bike that weighs about 100 to 150 pounds less. Obviously, there's less horsepower, but there's something to be said about bikes that are much, much lighter weight, which was kind of another conversation that we were going to have about this. But I just really think it's, the Honda CBR 250 and 300 and the Ninja 250 and the 300, those are like 350 to 370-ish pound bikes, but they're less than half the horsepower of like a day, they're close to the same weight and less than half the horsepower of some of these other offerings out there. For example, my bike is around 400-ish pounds and has
Yeah.
over just a little over 100 horsepower. So why can't these manufacturers build a smaller displacement? Obviously, a smaller motor is going to weigh less. And
Yeah.
aren't there materials that can be used that it all comes down to the bottom, the dollar, really. It's like profit and loss. They're looking at the profit and loss statements. Well, how much is it going to cost us in steel, and how much is it going to cost us to manufacture
Yeah.
that? What kind of tools do we need to make that bike, and blah blah blah. And all this
And that
sort of
seems
thing.
to have stilted a lot of motorcycle manufacturers. Really, they're not doing an awful lot new. All they're doing is pushing the envelope of what has already been done. Liter bikes are essentially the same as liter bikes of 10 years ago, but they've made them a little bit lighter, a little bit smaller, and But there's not really anything new per se beyond that, and part of that's part of the reason why I think sports bikes have fallen out of favour to a degree. That they just can't capture the imagination in the same way as that they used to be able to. There's only so many times you can read a headline of now it's got 200 brake horsepower, now it's got 205 brake horsepower, now it's got 210 brake horsepower, before you're just a bit bored of it all, really. And I think you're absolutely right. I think a small capacity, decent spec sports bike or street bike, I mean, they could make both without big problems, would be fantastic. And there are companies out there that already make perfectly acceptable engines that they could put straight in there even. Aprilia make a fairly small twin, I believe. But even more than that, if they really did want to keep it to single cylinders, you're talking about
Well, you know what, but
Euro bikes.
you know what bike I really thought was and still is the cat's rear end is the Aprilia SVX 4.5 or the 5.5. It's a V twin supermoto. That bike is just
They do both. Yeah, I
that
mean,
bike is just well, they don't make it anymore, but I understand that they had the motor had problems with the seals would go bad after a period, and it was a gas hog as well. Or, but man, that bike is just I love that bike. It looks great, it sounds great, and it's light as heck.
Slippery Mongoose has just made an extra point that apparently in Australia, Triumph is releasing a smaller version, or has released a smaller capacity. I presume what he means by that is they've sleeved the current Street Triple in order to comply with their learner laws over there. So you can buy a learner Street Triple.
Really? That's
Now, I
interesting.
assume what they've done is just they've sleeved the motor. So essentially, what they do is they put uh, a tube of metal within the cylinder, so that it makes the bore smaller, which then will bring the capacity of the motorcycle down, and it'll make it a slower motorcycle. It doesn't address the problem of weight, but it is a way of introducing a smaller engine without having to actually spend any money on
Right. Well, I
And the
mean,
good point of that is all the extra parts, like the suspension, the quick shifters, the indicators, the rear subframes, they're all exactly the same as the full-size bike.
mhm. Yeah,
Um,
this is what just. I mean, back in the '60s or '70s, you had the Creedler 50cc bikes going over 100 miles an hour.
yeah,
I think they had what, like 10, 12, 14 gears, but um, to get them there. But
certainly, but
it
it
can be
shows
done.
that
The
performance
point
is
is
there.
that it can be done. It
Yeah.
can be done. You can get a small capacity, high spec bike. Um, and because we've seen all of these huge leader bikes and 600 super sports that are 2, 3, 4 model years old now, still sitting in crates at dealerships, and they can't move these things. The market seems to be ripe for a smaller displacement, high spec motorcycle. It seems to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think so. Clearly, the manufacturers don't agree, but I think that's perhaps their natural conservatism. They don't really want to do anything until someone proves. It's kind of what we're talking about with the triple. I think MVAGusta certainly had history with the triple, but I think part of their thinking was, look, the Triumph has been successful with the triple, so why can't we, really? And all the benefits that exist for a triple, of course, as well. Um, I think, I've said this to you before, I think the first company that releases a decent spec, small capacity sports bike that could end up clearing up, cleaning up. I think they would end up selling a ton of them, just because all the people that have been saying they want one for a long time would have the choice of one, because nobody
Right.
else is going to do it.
Right.
Or at least not until, and this is essentially the problem with the motorcycle industry. No one else will make one until they see someone making one and making money from it. When they do, everyone will introduce one,
Well, I
which they
think
won't make a lot of money.
I think Ducati has struck a soft spot because their new scrambler weighs less than the Triumph. I believe it has more power than the Triumph. I believe it's light. It's lighter than the Triumph, and I think it's less expensive than the Triumph. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that they got something going there, because they're trying to pull people into, uh, you know, I just, that to me is a perfect example of proper marketing. That to me, the new Ducati Scrambler says to me that they're actually listening to. We want a lighter bike. We want a little bit more horsepower, and we don't want to pay. Can you give us a good price point? Of course, Ducati has the deep pockets of Audi, helping them out. So I think even if they make the bike at a loss, they're going to have a niche market there, to try to take a slice of the Triumph pie.
And Ducati would be great, a company that are greatly placed to build a single cylinder sports bike. They made the Super Mono back in the 90s, or they released the race bike version. They said they were going to release a street bike version, but in fact, in the meantime, they created the Monster, and that became almost too popular for them, so they actually had to shelve other bikes. So they never did make a street version of the Super Mono.
Hmm.
Uh, but if they did a modern version of it, then that isn't priced at the kind of price that they were talking about, which was about £50,000. So crazy money. But
We
they could make a single cylinder by essentially cutting one of their mid-sized twins in half. So let's take, I don't know, the 899, for instance, the Panigale 899. If they cut that in half, they would have a 400cc single cylinder with a desmodromic head, and that could be the basis of a fantastic lightweight sports bike.
hmm I totally agree, and I think,
And they can do it really easy. That's the that's the crazy part about it. I literally think they could do it in under a year, from start to finish, from design to on the market. They could do it in under a year. and yet they don't seem to, or they haven't thus far.
Interestingly, I saw a bike review where there were these new retro bikes. There's been a resurgence of the cafe racer, and you have the, what is it, the Yamaha 400. What is that bike? The classic.
Oh, the SR 400.
Yes, thank you. And then of course the Suzuki TU 250X. And then Royal Enfield has this new Cafe 500, which is based loosely based on the Bullet. Royal Enfield hit a home run with the design of that bike. I think it's they say that it's kind of come up short with fit and finish and quality control and so forth, but they're on the right. I think they're on the right track with that, where you have a single cylinder bike that's got oomph, and I think because you're seeing a lot of these supermotos spring up, maybe manufacturers are saying, wait, let's see if we can make a lighter bike, single cylinder, and start to reinvigorate the small, because small bike scooters and small displacement motorcycles is where it's at. I've looked at the quarterly reports, and I can tell you with nearly 100% certainty that that's where the sales are. The new and beginner bikes. There has to be a greater array or a wider array of smaller displacement fun bikes to be had. And I think KTM is.
They have a great basis to be able to do that. Well, certainly all the Japanese manufacturers could do that very quickly, because, as you say, they've got these super mono or these the single cylinder enduro type bikes, and there is no reason at all why they couldn't turn those into single cylinder sports bikes very easily. Some slightly shorter forks on the front. You can keep the same frame, you can keep the same engine, you can even keep the same wheels if you wanted to. And all you'd need is some shorter forks and some handlebars, and hey presto, and a fairing, and hey presto, there you go. I mean, there are people that do kits to transform them, but unfortunately you've got to then buy the kit on top of buy the bike, and by the time you've finished, you're actually at quite a high price.
Exactly. Well, I think we've sort of digressed or deviated a little bit from, but I think it took us in a direction that ultimately this is kind of what we're talking about. I think the days of there's always going to be, the thirst or the hunger, for more power. I got to have more power. Just got to have more power. Back to the whole the other triple offerings. Benelli was part of was supposedly going to be part of the discussion, because that is also a company that you said is now owned by the Chinese. And I think I believe you were telling me you were quite ready to pull a trigger on a brand new Benelli Tornado. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, this was a few years ago, 2010 or 2010 or thereabouts, and somebody I know was buying a Yamaha R6, and at the time I was very keen on convincing him to get something a bit more interesting. And one of the options that we ended up looking at was the Benelli Tornado, or the Tray 900 Tornado, which is a 900cc triple engine sports bike. Now, when they were first released, these bikes were in excess of £20,000 in England. Very expensive bikes. High spec components. You've got the Öhlins forks at the front, Öhlins shock at the back, Brembo brakes, forged wheels. Some of them even had carbon fiber fairings. So you're talking about high quality bikes. By the time the model was released shortly after the year 2000, if memory serves, and then they released some other derivatives of this, if essentially the same bike. By 2006 or 7, the company was on its last legs and going bust. And by the time it got round to 2009, 2010, when I was looking at it, they were offering brand new, unregistered bikes, still in the crate, for under £6,000. Now, bear in mind, these bikes had been up for over £20,000 to be able to get there, and there are still some of these bikes around. If someone suddenly gets or there are in England anyway, if somebody suddenly gets the urge to go and buy them, they're very good high spec bikes for a very low price, and you know, if you're in the market for buying a new bike, you can get a new bike from there for well under £6,000. The only downside is that they obviously don't come with a manufacturer warranty, because the manufacturer that manufactured them anyway doesn't exist. Benelli at that time had been an Italian manufacturer owned by the Italians. It has since been bought in name only by a Chinese manufacturer in order to produce new bikes. And indeed, I think they're intending to go to the TT possibly next year, possibly the year after, with their 650cc twin.
There's the I have it up on screen now.
Their new bike. Right. It's the first of their new bikes that are you know, going to be the Chinese-made Benellis. So essentially, they really bought it to give their name, to give a cachet name to their pre-existing bikes. So they're not quite the same as the Benellis of yesteryear. But as I say, there are still some of these triples around. If you want to grab yourself a bargain, speak to a Benelli dealer.
Yeah, so I have seen what do you call it? Some of these street fighters, Benelli street fighters, performing on the track, and I saw a couple of videos on YouTube, and I was really shocked. I didn't realize they were such incredible bikes.
Yeah, I mean, astonishing. Yeah, I mean, for the most part, their TNT, which is their sort of street fighter model, would kill most bikes in their class. Again, we were talking about compression ratios earlier on, and they have very high compression ratios, very over square engines, and certainly very powerful machines.
Wow. Well, we've covered a lot of territory in this short period of time, and I guess, you know, to sort of begin to segue to wrap this up, I think, you know, there are other three-cylinder, albeit them very few and far between. We didn't really mention the Yamaha FZ or the MT09 in Europe, the FZ09 in the States, which is kind of, in my estimation, it's sort of a motard-ish street fighter type of bike. It's not really a sport bike per se, but it's set up much more like a standard sort of dual sport almost, but like an oversized dual sport type bike. I threw a leg over one. I sat on one. I liked it. I thought it was quite comfortable. It's certainly more upright than the Street Triple is.
That's interesting in itself.
And it comes with the approximately 800 or 700 and some odd cc inline triple motor. Very torquey. I think it has about 13 foot-pounds more torque than the Street Triple does. But two different animals, really, and I think the rake and the trail are certainly different than the Street Triple. You know, if I had to guess, I mean, I would say that you know, the Street Triple is much more of a track, certainly a much more of a track-oriented bike than the FZ09 is. I just think that the FZ09 looks like it was designed with more of a utilitarian purpose in mind, that being commuting and even maybe some kind of
Oh dear. I think we've lost Mr. Zone for the time being. What I will do while we're waiting for him to reappear is mention these bikes, because we touched on them a moment ago before we were coming on to these. And if I can manage a screen share, I'm not sure if I'm able to do that. But if I can, you can see that there are these are sports bikes based on single cylinder enduro bikes. If you aren't able to see the screen that I have up at the moment, which I'm not 100% certain whether you can or not, I will put up the link in the chat box so you can be able to see exactly what we're talking about. But these are bikes that could be made by the manufacturers very easily. Right, it doesn't want me to put up a website either. Essentially, then, it is for 450gp.com. If you have a look up there, you'll be able to get direct to that address. I had to sneak it through without having a without having a website on them. But these, these bikes, you can see there's an Aprilia, a Kawasaki, a KTM, a Yamaha, or a Honda, or a Suzuki. So that's just about everybody. And using their single-cylinder tall bikes, tall enduro bikes, the road-based dual-capacity bikes or dual-purpose bikes, with a shorter front suspension and cast wheels rather than spoked wheels, you're able to make these fantastic looking little sports bikes that would be incredibly light, incredibly fun to ride, and up to about 90 or 100 miles an hour. It will be absolutely fast enough to have an absolute blast on. And I'm struggling to think of any rider really that wouldn't like to have a go on one of these. Pricing would determine really how popular they were, but if they could be done for a decent price, I'm convinced that they would be quite popular. But maybe that's just me. I'd love to hear people's views on it. And do you think what sort of price would you pay for a small sports bike like this? If the manufacturers were willing to create it, being a bit of an Aprilia and Kawasaki fan, the two that are on screen now are clearly my favorites, but there really isn't any difference between all of them. They are just the details. They are just the details of these machines. Anyway, right, so let me see if I am able to get Mr. Zone back onto this Hangout, because otherwise I'm just going to end up talking nonsense forever, and I dare say he'd never forgive me. You know, I can't type and speak, so you're going to have to forgive me. I need bring him, but it doesn't seem to be working. Oh, this is why professional TV companies have producers, so the people that are speaking can just speak. Right, if no, he's still not coming back. Well, I tell you what, if we can, we'll have the last go in the middle portion, the people hangout.